for now a few years. And thanks to the distinguished panel today that's joining me in bringing to life a project that took shape in my discussions with John Graham going back to when I was a member of the ASA KPAC committee several years ago. The goal then was to develop leadership resources to inspire and support association leaders to design and grow new programs and services and operating units that use business innovation tools to advance mission and grow non-dues revenue. So as you know from the announcement of today's program, ASA just released the first of 5 briefs that tell the story of how an innovation capacity model was converted into an organizational diagnosis tool and a set of resources to guide a targeted approach to advance innovation readiness. The format of today's session is that I'm going to ask each panelist to respond to some initial questions. We'll be talking about their prior experience with maturity models, advice on how to apply this intelligence model to their own circumstance. So some discussions of application. We also want to talk about the role of governance. All of us concur on one thing, that governance being responsive to these issues is really important to move an innovation culture forward. And we're going to close with all of us commenting in our own perspective on how the COVID crisis is creating new conversations and frankly, new reasons to embrace innovation, to advance both mission and to introduce new revenue streams. So I'm going to turn to the panel now, and as I call a question, I'm also going to ask the panelists to provide some context so they can talk a bit about the position they hold now and how it connects to the particular question. Paul, you're the first one in the queue for me, and I'd like to start the conversation. We had an earlier discussion about your own prior experience with maturity models. So why don't you share a bit about what you learned from your work with maturity models and how they were able to inspire and guide efforts to advance the purpose and the financial goals of your organization.
Great. Thank you, Barry. And by the way, the maturity model for innovation that you've developed based on your research, I've just had a chance to review, and I think this is going to be really quite helpful to my organization and others as we navigate through that. But the maturity models as a concept have been around for, I think, about 3 decades. They've been around for a while. And just a little quick refresher this morning, they were the initial ones were developed by a group out of Carnegie Mellon that has since been purchased by Osaka, another association, but the capability maturity model integration. And when we first stumbled upon it at ASA, we actually used it for a very specific project, and we were in the process of evaluating our clinical registry database, and our database, our clinical registry, was being criticized. This was about 4 or 5 years ago by many within the organization for not really being relevant to many of the needs that folks felt for the clinical registry. So we brought in a group, outside group, to help us look at improving upon that registry, and they applied a maturity model approach. And over time, I've used the maturity model system to look at a number of things. We looked at, so first our clinical registry, then we had a project to look at our financial operations, and later on at our information technology operations. And what we found in using the model is it's, first it gives an organizational view. I like the fact that we're not looking at a specific department, but we're looking across the organization. And each of these models, we covered, everything from, technology would be a piece, but practices, procedures, policies, culture, communication, client or internal and external customer service, all a part of this. So it's organizational, It's also objective, and it enables discussion that is non-accusatory, but really allows for what I would say is helpful generative discussions to look at where improvements need to be made, where capacity needs to be built, where capacity needs to be brought into the organization. So I've used this tool with several departments, including finance, IT, and our clinical registry. The development of criteria was also interactive. So before we applied the model, in each case, we made sure that the model was relevant. The consultants worked with stakeholders, and so there was buy-in, both external and internal stakeholders, our governing body, as well as our staff. And then once we agreed on those definitions, then we were able to move forward and do the analysis. Again, it allowed for robust discussion of perception, what data works, and what might need to be addressed. And as I think about the areas of innovation, I think our American Society of Anesthesiologists has actually done very well in a number of areas, in our technology, in our training, in our delivery of resources, and some of our educational tools. But it's not systemic nor as fast as it could be. And what I like about the model that Barry, your team has developed, it will allow for an assessment of what we're doing correctly and how we can improve. So anyway, let me stop there and see if you have any questions.
I think one of the points you raised that was resonates with my experience with having worked with prior maturity models and this one as well, as I've tested it out over the last year, is the value it has in stimulating discussion. We tend to look at these tools. Oftentimes we go to a session as CEOs and we with something we apply, but this is something that really, I think, is powerful, engaging the entire community in the journey. And it's something when it's explained that this is a tool to improve, and you make references to things that they have done in their own lives. They may not have called a maturity model, but they've used some template to inspire their own improvement, whether it's fitness or it's their own learning. And in that way, it's a positive start to what can be a little bit disconcerting, because it exposes areas that you're weak in. But just a comment about that. Is that how you used it? Take an example, maybe that you literally found people coming together, rallying around something.
It identified areas where, and what I found interesting, it really didn't expose people. It exposed culture, systems, and processes.
Yeah.
And so it enabled discussions that were really productive, that were really helping. Now, when we came out at the other end, we did the analysis, let's say in finance, technology, and our registry. We did have cases where people said, there's a new order being developed, and we're not comfortable with that order. So people did leave. But in the approach of developing it, we were really focused on the big picture, and it enabled, again, a reflective. I think the important part of this was the reflection that it allowed. And the final report was one endpoint, but it's really the conversation, as you've said, that's the most important part of this. As you're enabling the conversation, that's when the change begins to happen. People are thinking about culture and decision processes and how we dealt with client services, accountability, things of those types. It was really very helpful in this process.
Right. And then it becomes an ongoing conversation as well, too. As you celebrate some improvements and so forth. Tom, I think it's a perfect segue into your question, which is your own advice on taking the tool and putting it into action, and experiences you've had of what do you think has worked for your organization, in a game plan of how you could take this initial work and use it to catalyze your own objectives in your organization.
I thought it might be helpful to give you a before and after picture of what would happen at AGA. A few months before we took the innovation readiness survey, we formed an internal team. Everybody was trained in design thinking, and their jobs were to be coaches to other colleagues when they were designing a new program or trying to improve the current program. And I have to say, this was not a resounding success. What we learned was that we had a deeply entrenched culture that was resistant to change and was averse to taking any kind of controlled risk. So I just, as a commercial, I'd like to echo what Paul said. When we talked and I originally came across the model, I found it to be very helpful organizing components of the association and figuring out what to do and how to do it. So we took the innovation readiness survey. We fell above the peer average in 4 areas and below in another 4, but it was clear we fell far short on the high performance standard. And I'll be honest that the magnitude of things we had to address was intimidating. But it was obvious back, if you look back at our previous experience with our homegrown model, that we had to tackle this culture change. And we circled 2 of the domains. One was emphasizing collective purpose. And like many associations, we try to be all things to all people, so it's almost impossible to focus. I can't get staff and board to agree on what's important. It's like there's a 10-way tie for priority. So to address this, we launched an organizational-wide overarching initiative. One of the problems we have is that once fellows leave training, we have a huge fall off in membership before they go into practice. So we decided to tackle that to make sure that the lifeblood continued. So 30 of our 100 plus employees are on a component of this team focused on increasing retention of early career gastroenterologists. More to come on that, but we've instilled that in all the staff meetings, give an update about that initiative to keep our eyes focused on the ball. So that's our emphasis on sort of getting a collective purpose. The other thing we're focusing on is operational agility, and that referred to a lack of process, metrics, and linkages to the budget. We have all those things, but it's not good when everybody doesn't know what those things are. So a couple of tactics. One, I've implemented skip level meetings. I'm meeting with the direct reports of my direct reports, and we talk about their ideas as well. It's helped me uncover some of the misperceptions on staff about how things work at AGA. And also, I've encouraged my staff to do the same kind of skip level meetings in their departments. The other thing we've done is we call it a scrum. We have this weekly, almost all staff meeting where each department gives a progress report, but it's really tied back to the organizational initiative. And it's also, importantly for me, it shows whether we're making progress because we're reporting based on the previous week and whether there are impediments or roadblocks for progress, where before these things could just fester in some far corner of the organization. So just to recap, I've tried to take a smaller bite on the readiness survey, and we're focusing on collective purpose and operational agility.
So this point, Tom, about the ability to focus, was that a key benefit? Because like you said, if you start to look at your entire organization, whatever you're trying to do in change management, it can be overwhelming. So this notion of sort of prioritizing what you work on first, one of the things that on that score that I found intriguing was we found on those 4 elements that scored below the mean, that they weren't the same. In other words, there were some elements where you already had a consensus among your team that this needed to be addressed, where others seemed to be a little bit more divergence. So again, let's say across your opportunities, do you like to take on something that you already have some cohesion about, some consensus, or do you like to tackle where there's a little bit more dissonance in your team and address that one first? What's your approach?
We needed to go for, I wouldn't call it an easy win. We need to go for a place where we could make some quick improvement. There's no doubt that erosion of early career members is a problem. So there was no getting buy-in there.
Exactly. That's been my takeaway too, Tom, when talking to other CEOs, that getting that early win is important to motivate the team so they're not overwhelmed, and you build, literally like anything else, some momentum. And again, going back to fitness, in your own training, your own personal health, you want to get an easy win, so you feel you're making progress early on. I'm not sure if Chris has audio at this point.
Let's try. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can see you and I can hear you.
Are you
How are
getting
you?
a lot of echo or not?
We're getting echo, so you must have two mics going. I know you were trying to get audio earlier.
Wait. Okay, how about now?
That's good.
That's
Okay,
good. Thanks, Chris.
perfect. Sorry about that.
No problem. So, Chris, we're going to segue to you. And obviously, you heard from Tom and from Paul, and they held back. They gave you the real juicy topic here to talk about governance, because that's, we always say, the elephant in the room when we talk about innovation, because I think in conversations with all of you and knowing you, we always get into that conversation of how do we get the board to embrace what can be perceived by them as risk-taking. In my view, it's risky not to embrace innovation.
Right.
But why don't you share a bit about how governance plays a role in your capacity building?
All right. Thank you, Barry, and thank you to the foundation for putting forward what I really think is a really, really outstanding piece of work and a tool that'll be very useful even beyond healthcare organizations, because I could see how it would be applicable when I ran a healthcare organization, but also applicable to the last two CEO jobs that I had. So first of all, let me echo what the others have said, which is a very interesting, insightful, and useful tool. And benchmarking is always really helpful. But one thing that struck me when I read through the materials that have been produced to date is that all four of the readiness domains where the associations were laggard can be enabled or disabled by the association's governance. And I'm going to say processes, not structure, because in my own view, it's almost the processes that are more important than how the board is structured. So here's some reflections based on my experience. If you take the domain of operational agility, the processes of decision making are often slow in associations. I was just listening to a session before this where someone said it was taking them a year from a decision to put in new advisory boards for their global organization to when it could actually be implemented. And my guess is it was probably a year leading up to that decision, which means it was a 2-year process probably. And so I think that one thing that we all could think about is how can we work with our board to put in place decision trees or responsibility charting that would allow all these great innovations that are coming up through committees and through staff in partnership to have an easy gate to go through. Perhaps it's a low investment opportunity. It's below a certain budget threshold. Can we put in place a process that if it's below a certain budget threshold, it doesn't harm the reputation of the organization, staff can act quickly and get these things done and be held accountable for performance. The other thing that struck me was in foresight. I think all our boards are trying to do a really good job in trying to be diverse in terms of the membership constituencies that we represent. But how many of us are making their boards truly diverse in having a mix of member voices and yet outside stakeholders in the room actually part of the governance process, in addition or building upon what we probably all do, which is we bring in outside voices during a strategic planning process, or maybe we do some stakeholder interviews. But imagine what a board discussion might be like if there was an economist in the room, or maybe somebody for these healthcare organizations that have already been a venture capitalist and started for-profit, successful entrepreneurial businesses. I can just imagine a much richer conversation in the boardroom if we thought about different competencies on the board in addition to the diversity of the membership that we represent. And then if we go to empowerment culture, which talked a lot about co-production and co-design throughout the whole organization, I think we need to update our conflict of interest policies. How many of us have been in the boardroom? And I think this is particularly appropriate for specialty medical societies. Paul, you and I have talked about this many times, where a board member, because they're also on the board of a subsector of the industry, doesn't want to move forward quickly because we don't want to offend our colleagues and our friends, or gee, we can't compete with them. I think we need to figure out how to change that mindset. And I want to toss out an idea for us to think about. What if between management staff and the governance processes, we thought about our organizations more like venture capitalists, where we would be giving out funds to promising new ideas coming from around the world from our membership. And in return, we would, for promising startups, maybe they're for profit in nature, and in return, we would get the opportunity to be the market distributor of that new idea, maybe share in some revenue. I realize there's legal issues that would have to be thought about, but what if we thought about not everything being produced by us, but we're kind of the catalyst to seed new funding opportunities? And I was struck, Barry, you and I talked about sub-B corporations, and I pulled out a couple that are doing very well as certified B corporations that could be applicable to associations. So there's something called Aqua Clara Kenya. It's based in Kenya. These are water managers who are providing simple, affordable, and local clean water solutions for people living in rural and urban areas. They are organized as a for-profit organization with a social purpose. They also now have training apps and training tools. Sounds a little bit like an association to me. So that was one example. Or imagine if you were in the craft industry, something called Uncommon Goods. It's a marketplace of creative craft inventions, kind of like Etsy. But imagine if you did that for your members. You became the marketplace for their great ideas, and by the way, could make a profit for it. So those are just a couple examples. These are for profits, but they sound a lot like what we do as associations every day. So nimbleness, rethinking maybe how we do program development, to thinking about more being venture capitalists than the actual producer, manufacturer of a product, and thinking about how we get much more diverse thought around our board were a couple ideas that came to my mind. Thanks, you all.
Thanks so much, Chris. You know, thanks to bringing up those examples of B Corps, because it triggered my own journey. You folks know that the beginning of this maturity model actually began for me several decades ago. I started as a clinician. I wrote a textbook in diagnosis. I was fascinated with taking care of patients and finding their problems. And then I got into the organizations, and I had a responsibility to run nonprofits initially until 2008, when I became, for the first time, an association executive. Prior to that, my world was service-driven, essentially charitable purpose-driven nonprofits. So my executive experience was in that realm. And in that realm, you don't have the equivalent of a dues revenue stream or corporate partnerships that bring in money on a steady basis. You had to innovate on a regular basis just to stay relevant. And you were very focused on whoever your target audience was and bringing them value constantly with improvements. And so I was struck when I came to the association space and found that way of thinking wasn't as pervasive. Yes, there are examples, but the nonprofit charitable purpose space is where I drew a lot of the academic basis for this maturity model. It didn't come from the association world. It mostly came from the social entrepreneurship space. That was my more academic foundation to the maturity model, layered on top of my own experience in running nonprofits. I want to bring up now Lemmy to respond to a question that is all very much front and center, I believe, with all of us, is the COVID crisis and the belief that this is a time to innovate, or is it a time to innovate given this disruption? So Lemmy, I'd like you to start the conversation. As time permits, we're going to get some other members of the panel also involved, and I think something that is, again, so pervasive in our thinking day to day. So Lemmy, you want to comment about COVID and duty and purpose?
Sure. So ASHA, the American Speech Language Hearing Association, certainly has been impacted by COVID, and its members have, who are either in direct service delivery or they're at academic institutions training individuals to become clinicians. And it's had a significant impact as the numbers continue to get higher and people are talking about, so are children returning to schools? Which is where most of our members actually work, or are academic institutions going to have students on campus coming into classrooms and receive the opportunity to not only learn in these didactic situations, but will they also be able to learn in the clinical situations? And one of the things that ASHA had to do simultaneously was look at doing much more with a telepractice focus. Telepractice is something that several of our members were doing, but not the majority of our members. With the pandemic, there certainly is the opportunity to be reimbursed for telepractice services for both audiologists and speech language pathologists. So, and they don't have to get a license in the state in which the person who's receiving their services lives. But that's only true. It's kind of on pause for as long as the pandemic is happening. Well, the pandemic's happening a lot longer than any of us anticipated. So certainly, I think one of the things that we're looking at is being able to collect data and have appropriate data that speaks to the access to individuals who continue to need the services of audiologists and speech language pathologists, and payers, in addition to CMS, those private payers are paying us for those services. And that's a wonderful thing. In the midst of COVID, however, we could not ignore social injustices and systemic racism and the opportunity for ASHA to talk about whether or not it specifically was going to be an anti-racism association. So our board has had listening sessions from members who've given them a great deal of information, very passionate information about what they think the association needs to do in this space. So COVID said, pause, stop, you've got to pay attention. The social injustices that are happening are like, wait a minute, these things are still happening. How are organizations that are dealing with members, most of our members, 92% of them are Caucasian and most of them are females. So we really are looking at how do we bring in more equity, so not equality, but equity and inclusion within our organization, and multicultural issues, and teaching people to work with culturally and linguistically diverse individuals has been a part of our organization's structure, mission, priorities for many years. But how COVID and the social injustices are kind of not dovetailing, but the intersectionality of each of those at the same time really make this an important component that we have to address. And we need to do it explicitly. It couldn't just be something we kind of alluded to or that we just commented on relative to what we've always done. So how it's going to be impacted across all of what we do as an association and the duty and purpose of our association is something that our members want to make sure is clearly articulated, in addition to it being a part of the processes that we're engaged with.
Thanks, Lemmy. You know, this is so important to raise this issue of the linkage between social justice and what I like to call the social determinants of death. And unfortunately, clinicians have experiences with that. And we talk about it today, but this is not anything new. I went into public health a couple of decades ago because in the practice in inner city Boston, I learned very quickly the impact of housing, of food security, of conditions in the community that essentially were loading up the equation to generate more illness, disability, and death in communities of color. And that's why I went to public health. And here we have probably the greatest public health crisis of our generation. And so to me, this is the time to innovate for health associations. And it's purpose driven. But by the way, let's use social entrepreneurship, which we just heard from Chris earlier. Let's use the approaches proven that are venture oriented to make the right investments and therefore target our solutions to be sustainable, not just one, shot. Let's make systemic, you're not going to get rid of systemic racism without a systemic solution. Right. So we have to think about systems. Tom, I'd like you to comment about this issue of balancing this issue, the reality of trying to hunker down at the same time that we need to address a pandemic. So Tom, can you comment about that challenge that you're seeing in your organization about balancing the two forces at play?
Sure. Barry, you and I have talked about one of the immutable rules of medical guidelines is they need to be hugely expensive and take years to complete. But this crisis showed that our organization can do a guideline in a month. And whether we should be innovating or it's demonstrated that we can innovate when a crisis can focus us. So I'd say we're being forced to innovate or die. I mean, the old revenue streams are becoming antiquated. And I'll extend what Lemmy said about telehealth. And I would say that the healthcare payment system is changing profoundly. How do we help our physicians navigate that? And we're all dealing with meetings, right? They're fundamentally changing. How do we continue to deliver the same historical value with while maintaining fiscal viability?
Exactly. Good point, Tom. And by the way, please, those of you attending, we got a good group in attendance here. Please add your questions or comments to the chat. We'll be happy to respond to your questions as we move forward. I want to turn now to Paul and talk about this issue of the choice to innovate or not innovate, and even the point about leveraging sort of the non-traditional resources. Paul, can you comment about this, again, dialogue of innovate, not innovate, but how you can be leveraging resources along the way?
I really like this conversation, by the way, and the examples that are given, particularly Lemmy's examples and those of Tom as well. We're really, it's kind of funny. We have no choice to innovate. What I think most organizations that are navigating this time are innovating. The issue for me is how do we make it purposeful? How do we apply resources to it? How do we make it consistent and sustain it? We have a number of examples of how we've helped folks kind of get through this period. One was a robust educational program and series of resources that helped expand critical care capacity for COVID by helping members and hospitals and health systems transform their anesthesia gas machines into ventilators. That's one example. It was at the time it was launched, it was a massive effort to help increase capacity. But and Tom points out that innovation and payment is another area that we need to deal with. So I would argue we have no choice but to innovate. We need to create innovative experiences such as we're seeing today in meetings that will fill in for the in-person meeting experience. I think that events are forever changed. They'll come back eventually in some form, but now we're learning kind of a new way of interacting. Development, we are challenged to develop new revenue sources as organizations, but more important than that, new products quickly that meet the needs of existing markets. And for many of us, we're looking at how do we expand our market as well. So how can we apply our current sort of capacity to meet new markets, as well as how do we create new products for existing markets. So for instance, we're looking at parallel professions. We are an individual organization, but increasingly developing value for institutions that employ our members, certainly industry and international. I think, Barry, to your point, the most critical thing in sustaining innovation, I think, is access to resources. And so, of course, we have our own balance sheet. We have our own very talented staff. But what we're also do is we leverage relationships. And you have in your maturity model the whole ecosystem piece of this. It's called, let's see, where do we have it here? It's engaged ecosystem. And I really think that one of the things that we can leverage is because as associations, we have subspecialty organizations, we have related organizations, there are for-profit companies that we deal with. And so leveraging those to create strategic alliances are very powerful. So as two examples, we have worked with a simulation company out of Canada to develop a state-of-the-art virtual simulation program that helps train people through residency and active practice. We've also formed a partnership with a IT startup that helps link our clinical registry, helps kind of pull data from electronic medical records into our clinical registry. Wouldn't have been possible without tapping into those outside resources, which in turn have their own sources of capital. And then also grants. And so we've been active in recent months in applying for grant programs out of the government and out of the corporate sector to help finance those areas of innovation. So Barry, I hope that helped address the topic.
Absolutely. And I think you gave examples there that are applicable for different size organizations as well. I want to comment on Chris's addition to the chat. She's bringing up a point I think that's particularly relevant to Mallory, the mid-size or larger organizations. And that's the notion of tax structure or tax exemption. You know, we all talk about unrelated business income. When I came to the American Optometric Association, I was challenged with both increasing impact and addressing financial concerns. And I went with my gut because I had experience of starting a venture-funded technology company a few years before. And I said, why don't we create a for-profit subsidiary? We have a foundation, a C3, to help us raise grant money. Why don't we have a wholly owned for-profit subsidiary that allows us to raise money, including working capital, allows us to contract with partners in that ecosystem in a, frankly, more agile way than we could out of our C6 structure. So I think something going forward about implementing innovation is to consider different corporate models for doing that, whether it's something you incubate your own startup venture or you partner with other organizations or other companies to do that. I think it's a wide open space. You know, one of the notable things about governance was when we form, that is associations form, typically foundations, who do we get on the board of those foundations? People who can give or get money. Why? Because the foundation has to raise funds, right? So why not, when we're in the entrepreneurial space, in forming a new governance structure, form a wholly owned subsidiary that has who on the board? People who know business, people who know innovation, people who know digital transformation. So it allows you to strengthen your governance model by having a new round of experts. You can do that with, you don't have to form a subsidiary, you can do that other ways. But the point is, don't miss an opportunity to partner with other organizations or other expertise. Make the tent a lot bigger. I think that's one of the weaknesses, frankly, in associations tackling innovation is that they're not quite ready or feel comfortable. But I hope this conversation, Paul, your great examples inspire groups to move forward. We just have a few minutes. Any other points? I don't know, Chris, if you want to chime in on what we just chatted about as we round up, finish up our talk. You made reference to the idea of different tax structures and corporate arrangements.
Yeah, I think we need to fundamentally rethink, not abandon, but rethink and build upon the strengths. But I also have been struck about how many execs I've spoken to who I think are saying it's going to go back to the way it was. I have a totally different view of that. I don't think it's going to go back to the way it was because of the pandemic. I think that people are going to find technology is going to get better. Digital interactions are going to get better. Businesses are going to want their people to travel less, not more. And it's not that I think for in-person meetings will totally go away, but I don't think the expectation that everybody will gather in one place every year for a large gathering should be our future. And I would just encourage everybody to be very intentional about documenting during this time of rapid change what's working that's new, and think about how to build upon that, than thinking we will do those new things for a period of time and then we can take a sigh of relief. Because I don't think that's what's going to happen. I think things are going to be totally different about how people work, how they learn, how they gather. And it'll be some kind of blended virtual in-person experiences across the board. But we're learning a lot, and it's hard to take time to capture those learnings when you're in the midst of crises. But if everyone can just try to do that, I think that that'll be better association models in the future.
Thanks so much, Chris. That's a great way to wrap up. I think a lot of the items or issues we discussed with an optimism going forward, but a reality check. You know, I'm an epidemiologist by training. This thing's not going away. This is a two to 3 year period. We may be wearing masks and abide to some social distancing. That's not pessimism. That's reality. You know, denying reality is never a good strategy. That's my view. So thanks so much. Keith, tell me where we are. Is this time to wrap it up?
It is time to wrap it up. I'll leave us with just a couple things. First of all, thanks very much to our panelists for joining us for this conversation. I have noted in the chat a couple of times the ways in which you can access the initial report from this research. There will be 4 additional reports in short order. They're actually finished and will be moved into our ASAE bookstore, freely accessible by ASAE members by September. We're also going to be looking for additional ways to have conversations like this, perhaps in some expanded formats. So, because I think as this demonstrates, you know, the value is really in digging into this material and having conversations about it that you know, that lead to innovation. I'll leave it at that. Barry, anything you'd like to wrap up with?
Just another thank you, Keith. You've been phenomenal to work with in putting this together. Sharon Moss, hope you're still on the call. Garrett, folks at ASAE, thanks so much. It's been a great adventure for me, and looking forward to bringing the message forward in these coming months. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.